You're listening to Art Affairs, episode number 15. Today I'll be talking to Scott Listfield. Alright, so my name's Michael Faith, and this is Art Affairs. If this is your first time listening, Art Affairs is meant to give you a look at and into the new contemporary art community, featuring conversations with artists, gallerists, curators, shining a spotlight on the human side of the wonderful work they do. You can dig through previous episodes, complete with show notes, at artaffairs.podcast.com, and you can check out new episodes on all your favorite podcast platforms. Of course, if you like what I'm doing here, be sure to subscribe. And you can always connect with the show on Instagram and Facebook at Art Affairs Podcast. All right, so today's guest is Scott Listfield. Scott is most well known for painting astronauts, and sometimes dinosaurs. The astronaut figure that has been constant in his work pretty much throughout his career is an explorer in a very interesting world. One that at times aligns eerily close to our own, but sometimes it's an imagined version of what could have been. Sometimes it's a world that might be if we don't change our trajectory. But the one constant throughout all these versions of reality is this explorer, a vehicle into this world that Scott's been building. An explorer whose shoes, or like he likes to say, moon boots, we as viewers can step into and experience the world Scott's constructed. We talk about this accidental brilliance, as he calls it, of this concept in our chat today. We also talk about the value that his old design day job has had for his career, his experience painting murals over the last few years, his upcoming solo show at ThinkSpace, and a whole lot more. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Scott Listfield. Scott, welcome to the show, man. It's great to have you on.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
All right, awesome. So I want to talk a little bit about your background, as I tend to do. You grew up and spent a lot of your life in Boston, right? And
I did.
Did you actually live in the city proper when you were growing up, or was it more on the outskirts?
No, I grew up in the suburbs. I grew up about a half an hour due west of Boston.
But you were close enough to where you probably spent a lot of time there, right?
I spent some time there. I mean, my dad worked in Boston. I would go visit him when I was a kid. I lived a very suburban lifestyle, which was different than living in the city. But yeah, sure. I went to Boston a number of times when I was a kid growing up.
Okay. And you mentioned your father working in the city. What sort of work did your parents do? Did you come from like an artistic family at all?
Oh no, not in the slightest. I was a little bit of a mystery to them, which was fine. I've since learned that I have a lot of art sort of further afield in my family, which I didn't immediately realize. My parents, I love my parents. They're great. They've been very supportive, but they're not the least bit artistically inclined. No, my dad worked in banking, and my mom was a teacher.
Okay. So like, how did you get exposure to art and ultimately take an interest in it? Did you have an interest in it as a kid, or was it something that you came to a little bit later?
Oh, sure. I always loved doodling. It was not a thing I was especially or even remotely serious about until I think maybe college or so. But I was always drawing, even from a very young age. Like I loved doing it. I was always doodling. I was cartooning. I had a sort of cast of random cartoon characters that were partially made up and partially cribbed off of other people that I would draw all the time. So I had a real passion for it from a young age, but it never occurred to me as something to pursue later in life until like I said, until I got to college. And at that point, I realized that art could be a more serious pursuit.
And I, from what I understand, you actually legit, and no joke, wanted to be an astronaut at some point. Like as a kid,
sure.
Like that wasn't just like a revisionist history thing. Like you legitimately wanted to be an astronaut.
Oh, it was certainly legit, but it was not realistic. It was, when I was probably, it was the very first thing I wanted to be when I was a kid, which I think is true of a lot of people of my generation. I don't think I'm alone in that one. I mean, it was, if you'd asked me when I was 5 or 6 what I wanted to be, I would have said an astronaut. If you asked me when I was 7 or 8 what I wanted to be, I probably would have said Superman or something. So, it was not, it was definitely legitimate. I are quoting for folks at home. It was definitely legitimate. But it was not realistic. I hadn't thought through the details of what being an astronaut would be all about.
So when it came time to go to college, you ended up going to Dartmouth, which I mean, like that's no joke. That's an Ivy League school. Like you must have been really good in school, right, to get into there.
I had my moments. Sure. No, I was. It's fun. I don't talk a ton about my school because it's not exactly known as a hotbed of aspiring artists, really. Yeah, I was a decent student in school. I worked hard. My parents pushed me pretty hard. The expectation was that I would, work hard in school and go to as good a college as I could get into, and that was about as good as one as I got into. So, yeah, I guess I was. I don't think too much of it like that, but yeah, I was.
Does Dartmouth have a good arts program? Because when I think of Ivy League school, I really think, I don't necessarily think of them as art focused so much as like law or doctor,
Yeah. Well, I used to have a joking, a humor. I sort of passed it off as a joke in my art statement. I said something like Scott Listfield studied art at Dartmouth, which was not the smartest thing to do. And then I ended up cutting that out because it sounded like I found like I was denigrating my education in some way, which I don't mean to do. But it was not the bright. You don't go to an Ivy League college to study art. Well, people do. I did. I know other people who did, but it does have. I don't want to say it has a great art program, but I also don't want to say it has a bad art program because that sounds like, again, like I'm insulting my professors. My professors were very good, but most people do not go to Ivy League colleges to study art, or at least they didn't go to Dartmouth to study art. But there was an art program. They were serious about it. I'd say the big difference is I don't think that they trained. Most of my friends now in the art world went to legit art schools, and had some sort of formal training. I think when my education at Dartmouth, I don't think they were trying to train me to become a professional artist. I don't think that was the goal, which led me to some problems later in life. But I also don't blame them for that because I don't think that's what the goal should be for a place like that. They trained me to think a lot and be very smart about my choices, and I think that actually served me pretty well in school. And in later life, I realized when I got out of school that I did not have, the formal chops that a lot of people coming out of art school had, but I could think about art and I could think about the way I wanted to talk and write and speak and formulate ideas about art in a way that maybe other people did not have those skills. And so certainly early in my career and even now, I kind of lean on those things as the part of the education I had that maybe other people were lacking in.
Okay. And did you go into your education at Dartmouth with the intent to become an artist, or was that something you figured out midway through?
No. So like I said, I always loved drawing, but it was not anything I was even serious about at all until I got to college. And it was really my very first semester at Dartmouth. I was signing up for classes. It's a liberal arts school, so you can take a lot of different things, and you have to take a lot of different things. And I was excited to try some things that I took an anthropology class, which I barely even knew what that meant. I took a philosophy class. I took all kinds of random things. But that very first semester, I got there, and the thought of not taking an art class sounded really grim to me. I'd always taken an art class. I couldn't remember a time where I hadn't had an art class. And in high school, I spent almost all my free time hanging out in the art room, even though I was not very good at it. I just liked being there. I liked being around the environment. I liked doing those things. And so I just couldn't imagine a world where I didn't take an art class. So I signed up for a basic drawing class, and I got there, and everyone was using charcoal, which I'd never used before, and felt like a very adult, like a grown-up person medium. And I'd been using crayons, like legit crayons in arts, like as a deliberate choice to be kind of juvenile. And so I was kind of lost. I felt like I was, swimming in the ocean for the first time as opposed to a pool. I looked around, everyone was better than me, and it was kind of intimidating, and I didn't really know what I was doing. And then about halfway through that class, I just had a realization that I came in late one night into the art studios, and I realized there's a whole bunch of people there hanging out drawing. And it had occurred to me that you should take this art class as seriously as you would take other classes, which in hindsight seems kind of stupid, but there was this real community in that very first drawing class I had. Like, I'm still friends with a lot of people in that class, and other people in that class have gone on to pursue very creative careers. And so it was about halfway through that class where something clicked that, okay, let's take this seriously. Let's stay here late at night. Let's hang out and do some drawing. And so, by the end of that class, I kind of thought, well, art might be a thing I might want to major in. By the end of that year, my first year in college, I realized art was definitely my passion. And by the next year, I took my first painting class, and it kind of dawned on me that art was the thing that I wanted to do with the rest of my life. So it wasn't until I got to school, but then it sort of happened pretty quickly once I was there.
Very cool. And were your parents supportive of that decision?
They were as supportive as people can be who did not want me to major in art at Dartmouth, which is a roundabout way of saying I'm pretty sure they would have loved for me to major in economics or something else. But once it was clear that I wanted to study art, they were very supportive. My parents are very practical people. They're, like I said, they don't have an art background. My dad always said, what I want you to be able to do is get out of school and support yourself and get a job. When you go to a liberal arts school, people study philosophy, and philosophy is not a job, and people study English, and English is not really a job. You can study whatever you want, as long as you get out of school and have some sort of pathway forward in life. And that's what my parents were worried about, and rightly so. The world's a tough place, and I think I made them proud by not only studying art, not only pursuing art, but carving out a career for myself. I don't know if we'll get into this, but I worked full time as a designer for 15 years out of college, on top of pursuing art. And so now, my parents were definitely, I'm sure they had moments in private where they talked to each other and said, "What on earth is our son doing?" They've become among my biggest supporters. They're obviously very proud of me, and I appreciate that greatly. I don't think I could have done what I've done without that support from them.
Yeah, for sure. That's awesome. And from what I understand, you actually spent the last year of your school living in Italy. Was that part of some kind of like study abroad program that Dartmouth had?
No, it was. I spent. It was not the full year. I spent one semester living in Italy, and then we'll get into this. But then after I graduated, I lived abroad in Australia for a little while. Dartmouth did have really good programs for studying abroad. The art program itself did not have one of those, which maybe is somewhat telling. And I realized kind of late in the game that I wanted to go abroad. I grew up in a small town and then went to school in a small town, both in New England. And I was kind of content with that. I realized that I was not ready for a big city when I was 18, and I'm kind of glad I didn't go that way, because I just don't think it would have gone well. But by the time I was 20, I was kind of chafing at living in a small town. Like, I needed to see more of the world. And I was very, again, at 18 or 19, I would have been scared to death to go anywhere on my own. But I suddenly got very bold out of nowhere and decided I had to actually petition the school to take part of my senior year off, because they didn't really like you to do that. But they let me. And so I took the first portion of my senior year. I studied in Italy in a program called SACI, which was an outside program that is run in Florence.
And do you feel that was a valuable experience, like that sort of immersive learning environment?
Yeah, the school itself was fine. I don't want to speak ill of the school. The school was fine, but the much larger thing was living in a different culture and just being exposed to not just another culture, but all of Renaissance Italy. It was that was stuff. I was an art major in school, but I studied art history as a minor, and so I had a real passion for that. And there's just almost no better place to be. And so the ability to be there, and at the time, in the moment, it was studying the art history that was most valuable to me. In hindsight, what has stuck with me was was getting out of America and living in a very different culture and seeing the world and hopping on a train by myself, kind of scared, but doing it anyways, and traveling around Europe on my own. That was the experience that really was an education beyond anything I could have gotten anywhere else, and has really, I think that was the impetus for everything that I'm doing now in my work. That was kind of the starting seed of it all.
Well, yeah, I mean that's even an education in just life, just
sure.
getting exposure to other cultures and just appreciating things that are different than what you're used to. So you mentioned Australia, and I wanted to ask you about that because it's interesting. You came home for graduation, you spent like 3 days, and then you got on a plane and moved to like Australia. What prompted that?
Well, the joke I like that this is a little bit in hindsight. What I like to say is, like I said, I went to college in a small town in New Hampshire, and then wanted to move as far away on the planet as I could immediately thereafter. The truth of it was, I actually came back to school for a semester. I finished up my senior year, and at that point, after traveling Europe, I was kind of done with small town New Hampshire. I needed to get out of there. Not only was I chafing, I feel like I had all these ideas about things I wanted to paint, and then immediately upon getting back, I painted some of them, and then kind of retreated into this bubble because I just felt kind of closed up. So at the time, my father, who I mentioned earlier, he was actually working in Australia. His job was in Sydney, and he was flying back and forth to Boston, every 3 weeks or so, which is kind of a grueling schedule. So his job, this is unbelievably lucky on my end. His job, I think, felt bad for doing that to him. Basically gave me a free flight to Australia,
Wow.
and he had a place to live there, and so I literally could just hop. There's no other 21-year-old who gets to do this. I could just fly to Australia for free and live there for free, and I literally had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. So I obviously said yes, let's go to Australia for free, which again was an amazing opportunity, and I feel very fortunate that I was allowed to do that.
What did you do while you were out there?
A large part of it was I just walked around the city. Again, I loved exploring at that point in my life. But I did have, a purpose. Because again, like I said, my parents are practical, and I think the unsaid bargain with me studying art in school was that I would try to find a career. And so the two options I had coming out of school, at least in my mind, was I could pursue design in some capacity, which I hadn't studied in school, but seemed like a very creative and art adjacent career. Or I thought maybe I'll go into museum or gallery work. And so the two things I did when I was in Australia was I took classes in design at a local, it was more of like a adult education facility. But it was career minded. So I took design classes there. I studied Photoshop and Illustrator and things like that. And then the other thing I did was I interned at the Biennale of Sydney, which is kind of like the Venice Biennale, only not not as prestigious. Sorry, Sydney Biennale. But I worked in their office putting together this large arts festival, which even though I was as an unpaid intern, I was mostly stuffing envelopes, and I actually literally swabbed a deck as part of the job. There was an installation at this old wharf, and my job was just like mop this like 200-year-old wharf. So it was not, I was not exactly learning the ins and outs of what being an arts administrator is all about, but it was enough for me to kind of learn whether that was something I wanted to pursue in life. And it was a lot of fun, but I decided I did not want to go into that realm of work, which in hindsight I'm kind of okay with, because I know artists who work in galleries, but that team seems a little too much like watching the sausage get made for me. Like I think a little bit of separation between the day job and the night job is maybe for the best.
Right. So like around 1999 was when you came back to the States, came home to Boston.
Mm-hmm.
Really, that was around the time period, from what I've read, that you really got determined about figuring out your art career and really got serious about developing your unique style. What gave you that determination? Was it just, hey, I've done all of these other things, now it's time to get serious?
Well, so I think of it as in two stages. I actually don't think I got serious about my art career at that moment, but that was the time where I sort of came up with this idea for painting astronauts. which I can go into that if you'd like for your
Yeah, yeah.
listener enjoyment. So I returned home, like you said, I returned home in 1999 after about, I wasn't in Australia all that long, but it was a very formative time for me. I was there maybe 5 or 6 months. And I reached a point where I was actually offered a entry level job in Australia in design, but I couldn't legally work there. I didn't have the proper visa. So I needed either to stay in Australia goofing off, which in hindsight maybe would have been a more fun option. But I wanted to get a job. I wanted to start my career. I didn't want to live in this sort of limbo. So I came back home to Boston, and I got a job. I got an entry level job doing design. I got an entry level apartment. I was living an entry level life. The way I like to tell the story is that after living abroad for a long time, you get used to, not that it was that long, but you get used to this idea of being not from there. You feel a lot like a sort of stranger, and you just get used to that idea that everything is kind of new and foreign. And every time you open your mouth, people look at you a little funny because your accent's off. And, every time you go somewhere, it might be the first and last time you ever go to that place, which is an odd sensation. And when I got back home to Boston, I thought that feeling would go away. And I was very surprised to find it didn't. If anything, I felt more out of place. And I've since learned that's actually a very common phenomenon, that when you come back home, you still feel kind of out of sorts like that. And so on top of that, like I got my first real full-time job. I was adulting, I'm air quoting, I was adulting, not doing a very good job of it. I was living in this crummy apartment. Well, it was not a crummy apartment, sorry. If my old landlords are listening, it was a very nice apartment. It was a very small, tiny apartment. It was like the tiniest apartment in all of Boston. And I just felt like I was, I just felt like I was trying everything the first time and kind of failing at it. And I felt even I remember I had this moment in the supermarket where I wanted to buy Oreos. This is a story I've told a bunch of times. And after living abroad for so long, when I was in Italy, all I wanted to buy was Oreos, which is ironic because Italy, the food is amazing, but I just wanted Oreos because it reminded me of home. And then I finally got back home and I went to the supermarket and the aisle had 10,000 kinds of Oreos. And I was just overwhelmed with choice. I was like, what are orange pumpkin Halloween Oreo? Like, what is that? I don't even know. I just want Oreos. It was just 100 moments like that where I just didn't feel at home in my own culture. And so it was around this time I watched 2001: A Space Odyssey for the first time, which is a really trippy film. And it struck me right in that moment, like as I was watching this film, that I was trying to figure out what paintings I wanted to make about these feelings I had, about feeling kind of lost and lonely and exploring this world I didn't understand. And I wanted there to be a protagonist in these paintings, and I didn't want it to be me. I wanted it to be some sort of other being, really. And so watching 2001, it kind of hit me all in that moment that the character I wanted to have in these paintings was this astronaut from the fictional 2001, the one that I thought I would grow up into, this world I thought I would live in, where I would live on the moon and have a flying car and a robot best friend, and not be living in this tiny apartment and cooking ramen noodles over a hot plate. And so I took that character, this astronaut from the fictional 2001, and kind of plunked him down into some facsimile of the real 2001 to explore. I'm answering this question super long, and I haven't even really gotten to the answer to your specific question, which was, when did you get serious about it? That was the moment where I had this idea and started painting these astronauts. But it took me another 3 or 4 years to really get serious about it. Because I was working a full-time job, and it was really hard for me to kind of juggle both these things. I also just started dating this fantastic young woman who now is my wife, but at the time she was my girlfriend. And so I was just figuring out a lot of things in life at the time. And it took me a while to get into the groove of painting. So, we'll jump ahead 3 or 4 years. I'd had like a little bit I had a coffee shop show. I had shown in, community center, which are perfectly fine, ways to start out your art career. But I reached a point where I had to admit to myself that art was at best a kind of hobby, and realistically maybe not more than that. And there's nothing wrong with doing art as a hobby, but when I was in college, I got really, really passionate about art. I mean, that was kind of all I had. I was, a kind of typical angsty teenager, and I kind of poured all my everything into art. And that was kind of the bargain I made with myself that, I might be sad and lonely and depressed, but at least I was I had art, right? I think a lot of people do that. And I got to this point, 5 years later, where the art was not really a thing. And I felt like I had let down that younger version of myself by letting it kind of lapse. And I'll get sort of serious and depressing just for a moment, and then I'll get back to telling stories about Oreos. I had a good friend of mine in college. His name was Chris Ostoy. And he was kind of a mentor to me. He was a couple years older than me, and he lived a really interesting life. And he was one of the most unique people I've ever met. And and the way these things happen with people you meet along the way who are kind of larger than life, he ended up passing away very young. I'm not sure kind of why that is a thing that happens to people like that, but it just sort of is. And I heard that I had somewhat lost touch with him, although I kept up with him a little bit, but I hadn't seen him in person in a long time. And I found out kind of secondhand that he had passed away right around this time. I was about 5 years out of college. I was maybe, well, maybe not quite. I was maybe 24 when I heard, maybe 3 or 4 years out of college. At any rate, it kind of hit me pretty hard. At that time in my life, I hadn't dealt with death in any sort of meaningful way, which I realize is also kind of fortunate that I made it to that age without having to deal with that. But for it to be somebody so young, and I really kind of felt like, we had this sort of ongoing, it wasn't a joke, we took it kind of seriously. We were going to move to New York and take over the art world, even though we kind of realized that was an unrealistic premise. That was kind of the thing we wanted to do. And I realized that, now that he was gone, it was up to me. I was the only one left to do that. And I looked at what I was doing in my life, and I was relatively content. I had a serious girlfriend. I had a job that I enjoyed. I was doing just fine, but the art part of it was lacking. And I felt like not only did I let myself down, but I kind of let him down. And that if anyone were going to go on and do this, it was going to be me now. I kind of had that burden on my shoulders. And so that was literally another split-second moment where I just kind of realized, like, I have to do this. I have to do this.
That's like a heavy responsibility.
Yeah, it is. And I didn't handle it super well at the time. I've sort of, in hindsight, as the years have gone on, I've tempered that responsibility, so it doesn't feel like a burden anymore. It now feels like a thing I want to do. It was, to me, was return to the passion that I had for art. And so that's maybe a good way of thinking about it, as opposed to this sort of like carrying some burden. And so I decided I had no idea how I would get an art show. I didn't know how that was done, other than vaguely, but I decided at the very least, I would get together enough paintings to have an art show, so that if it came up, I was ready, which at that point I was not. Like I said, I had maybe 10 paintings. And so I buckled down and made a bunch more paintings, and ended up having my first show in a gallery in Boston, because I knew a guy who knew a guy, which is how these things always happen. And he was opening a gallery, and the artist he had lined up dropped out at the last minute, and he had seen my work, and he invited me to do it, and I was ready. I had 20 paintings ready to go.
So when you were working your full-time design job for many years, and you have a personal life, when did you actually have time to paint? Like, was that a challenge to fit that much, basically a whole second career, into your off hours?
It was, and that's why it took me a long time to get to the point where I could do that. I often liken it to people who get up early and go jogging, which is funny because that's not a thing I would ever want to do. But people who do it, you get into this rhythm of doing it every day, and it's kind of about the rhythm. And if you stop doing it for a while, it gets kind of hard to get back into it. But if you do it every day and you don't do it for one day, you kind of feel that lack. And so I would carve out, a couple hours at 2 to 3 hours every night. I'd come home from work, I'd have dinner with my wife, I'd hang out for a bit, and then I'd go in the studio every single weeknight. And then my wife, she became a nurse, and so she worked some unusual hours. She'd work on weekends, and just sort of any moment I had, I would just hop in the studio and carve out a little bit of time. And it was just a matter of getting used to it. And then also I really, really enjoyed that time in the studio. It never felt like a burden. Even if I was kind of tired and sitting on the couch and watching TV, I knew that if I went in the studio and just sort of forced myself to get in there, once I got in there, I would be fine. And that's, 99% of the time that was true.
So how did you eventually make that transition to where you could give up your day job, your design job?
So, people used to say to me all the time, like, "Oh, I bet you can't wait to give up your day job and paint full time." And to be honest, the answer for a long time was no. I had moments, but I mostly enjoyed the day job. But the thing that it allowed me was a lot of creative freedom, especially in those early days, to make paintings as weird as I wanted them to be. I think, I don't know, I'm doing all right for myself now, but the early days, I don't know if this will surprise people or not, nobody was all that interested in buying these weird astronaut paintings I was making. And that was perfectly fine. I had my day job. I didn't need to worry about the paintings supporting myself. And that allowed me a lot of freedom to make some frankly ridiculous choices in my paintings that down the road were good decisions. At the time were maybe really stupid things to paint. And so I kind of liked having the day job for that. And I also painted through the recession in 2008, but had my day job. Thankfully, I didn't lose that. And that, my art career at that point went back to stage zero. I mean, every gallery I'd worked with at the time kind of went out of business. And so I think if I had been painting full time and trying to make a career out of it, that might have just ended the career, right? That would have been really frustrating.
Yeah.
So but I did, like you actually mentioned this, I reached a point where they were kind of competing with each other, where the painting career, I mean, what you want as an artist is success. And then it's always careful what you ask for, because then success comes and you're like, holy crap, I have a lot of work to do. And so it did reach the point where the day job and the painting job were like having two full-time jobs. And I would have had to turn down some opportunities in the art world that were really exciting in order to keep the day job. And at that point, I was a little bit tired of the day job anyways. I would have probably moved on from what I was doing at that point anyways. And so I said, I kind of just took a leap of faith, knowing that, I'll be honest, I pitched it to my wife as maybe like a 6-month thing, because I could always go back and get a design job somewhere else. But the 6-month thing turned to a year thing, which turned to a 2-year thing. And which now has been over a 4-year thing. And I was surprised to find that doing more work led to more shows, which led to more shows, which led to more opportunities. And I don't know, I've been doing okay with it ever since.
That's awesome. So let's dive a little bit more into the world that you've been building over the years. You talked about the impetus of it, how it was sort of this beginning of this feeling of alienation in your own home, effectively. Mm-hmm. Did you ever imagine that this idea would end up spanning like your entire career? Like, was that the plan from the beginning, or was it just like one painting that just became two and then a whole career?
That's pretty much exactly what happened. Yeah, I like to describe it as a very, very accidentally smart idea. That at the beginning was probably a stupid idea. I think the idea came to me while watching 2001, and I immediately knew it was kind of a clever idea to paint an astronaut wandering around the world. I had no idea I'd still be doing it 20 years later, and I had no idea the sort of depths that sort of figure had. It was, even though it was kind of a smart idea, it was in a large part a bit of a juvenile idea. I think I mentioned my art education before. Most of my professors were second and third generation abstract expressionists, and so they taught me in this sort of method where when they got out of school, painting narrative paintings or painting representational paintings was not a thing anybody did. There's this idea that you would study still lifes and you study the model or whatever, but then eventually you'd move into abstraction or conceptual art or something like that. And I got out of school and I realized I wanted to tell stories. And so painting an astronaut kind of felt, and doing stupid things like painting Chewbacca into a painting and painting Busta Rhymes into a painting in like 2002. Those kinds of things felt like, this is going to sound harsh, but like a middle finger to like my art education. Which I was not like that aggressive about it, but I really felt like I kind of wanted to just put that in a closet and do something totally different. And so the astronaut and dinosaurs, I painted some dinosaurs early in my career too. That just felt like a thing you should not do, and that's what drew me to it. And like looking at a lot of my source material was like cartoons I watched growing up, and like things that were not the sort of smarty pants art education that I had. And I kind of liked the idea of rejecting all of that. So it was definitely a juvenile impulse to start painting an astronaut. But it wasn't until a little later that I kind of realized this astronaut was this kind of almost perfect empty vessel to project all sorts of emotions into. And that just to figure the fact that, after painting about 3 or 4 of these astronauts, I started painting the face mask blank. The very earliest ones, you can kind of see the face behind there. And I realized early on that was not the kind of image I wanted to portray. I wanted to feel like this sort of any person. And just the fact that the astronaut wears this sort of suit that's kind of shiny, but kind of white and kind of just sort of blank. There's a lot of, it really is a blank slate you can project almost anything into. And that was not something I planned for, but it was something I kind of realized. And that's the idea that has allowed me to paint this for 20 years. And also the fact that, a lot of artists at a certain point when they've had some success, or even before then, they start feeling kind of locked into what they do and start kind of pushing against that. And they start feeling kind of almost not resentful, but like, oh God, I really want to not paint this thing that I'm known for anymore. And people ask me that all the time, like, oh, will you ever not paint an astronaut? But I'm very, very lucky. And again, this is a total accident, but I'm lucky in that these paintings have become more about the world that the astronaut explores. I can literally paint anything, and I can put the astronaut anywhere, and that's really, really liberating and freeing and exciting. And so 20 years later, I'm as excited about it as I ever have been, because there's so much left to paint.
Well, and not only does it give you the flexibility to sort of paint whatever you want and have that astronaut live within that world, but it also gives an empty vessel for the viewer to kind of put themselves into the painting, right? Mm-hmm. And was that sort of the intent of it as well?
Very much so, yeah. And again, maybe not the first few paintings, but that was something I very quickly realized, that I wanted the viewer to sort of put themselves in the shoes, or I guess moon boots, so to speak, of the astronaut and kind of walk around in this world. And again, in the early stages, I had no idea if that idea was translating. And I feel very lucky that now I hear from people all the time who pretty much grasp that immediately. They get that sense from the paintings. And I think if you see just one of them, you might go, what is this astronaut doing here? But then if you see 2 or 3 of them, you kind of realize, okay, yeah, I'm a wanderer, and I'm kind of meant to be in that headspace where I'm also wandering around and looking at these things and wondering what the heck is going on.
And you mentioned this earlier, and I think it's a pretty profound, whether or not it was accidental or not, it was pretty brilliant. This idea that it's sort of a blending of the imagined future we thought we were going to have in like the 50s mm-hmm. with our current future. And it's almost like, and I think I've read this in some of the articles that I've been reading leading up to this chat, that the sci-fi that was written back in the 50s and 60s, it almost became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like mm-hmm. our scientists used those ideas to create what we have now today.
Yeah. And the thing that really cracked me up was a few years ago, they actually made the shoes that Michael J. Fox wore in Back to the Future in the future, which is like my mind started exploding. Like that was almost some Inception level weirdness where it's like, what future are we living in where this,
right?
Where we invented this future in 1991 or whenever Back to the Future 2 came out, and then the future we got doesn't look anything like that, but then we decided just to make it anyways because we could. Like that's
it was like our best attempts at recreating what we thought we were going to have.
yeah. So it is this weird loop where the future we think we're going to get, we don't get, but then we kind of manufacture anyways. Those are ideas that I kind of quickly realized that just because I was painting the astronaut wandering around this world and I was painting it sort of realistically, it didn't mean it needed to portray the exact 21st century I was seeing. And then I could start playing with all these ideas about the future that we thought we were going to get, but that we didn't get. But then the future that we did get sometimes is even weirder than the one we thought we were going to get. And I've always loved playing with those ideas in my work.
Yeah, and you're obviously telling a much larger story, like across the entire span of your career. But do you tend to take single paintings or maybe single shows and conceptualize a smaller like chapter to that story?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. When I first started getting larger shows of my work, I would just sort of do all these. The astronaut was the consistent theme, and I think the work kind of held together. But every single painting was a sort of one-off of like some unique, weird idea I had. And as my career sort of grew, and that's largely been over the last 4 or 5 years, I started getting more solo shows of my work. On the one hand, it's hard to come up with 20 discrete ideas for a show, but I also liked the idea much more of coming up with one sort of overarching theme for each show. which I really thought of as sort of a unique chapter in this story I was telling. And it allowed me to kind of take some weird left turns into things that might be very specific just for a show. And it was a lot of fun to do that kind of thing. Like, I had a show in San Francisco about a couple years ago at Spoke Art. That the show was called Algorithm. And I had my very last day job before I left was I was working at Twitter. And they would fly me out to San Francisco every now and again. And San Francisco is this weird tech bubble where all kinds of strange, you got guys riding unicycles down the street. You've got self-driving cars roaming around. And so, it feels this weird, like manufactured utopian future. But on the other hand, they've got a real problem with, with homelessness there. And the city's got some real issues. And there's gentrification issues there that are really very problematic that some people are trying to work on, and other people are just sort of politely ignoring. And so it seemed like this real double-edged sword of these people trying to make this weird manufactured future while ignoring the problems of the present. I'm sorry if I'm speaking for San Francisco, but I feel like everyone there kind of knows that their city has these weird issues. And so when I had a show there, I made a whole show about this idea. It was called The Algorithm, because this idea that social media will be the cure of all these problems, which, I think we can all agree that social media has had some benefits, but has created this whole weird host of other problems that we're not totally addressing. Anyhow, and then I had a show in Los Angeles at ThinkSpace called 1984. Around the time, it was a year or two after Trump was elected, and everyone was thinking about, the book 1984, which had come out, 60, 70 years earlier, was suddenly a bestseller for obvious reasons. And so I made this show that was about the book 1984, but it was also about the year 1984. And I used some crazy pinks and purples, and I was using 80s design elements. And so thinking about these shows as kind of discrete chapters in my work allowed me to incorporate some interesting, weird elements that I don't think I would have otherwise pursued.
Do you tend to figure those show-level narratives out in advance, or do you start working and then let the work sort of organically define that narrative?
I try to come up with the ideas in advance, because that, if I come up with a really great show idea ahead of time, it makes the work flow so much easier. I could do a whole bunch of research ahead of time and figure out kind of what kind of imagery I want to, and have at least a rough idea for what the first few paintings are going to be. It's a much more of a struggle if I don't know what the show is going to, and I've had shows where I didn't really know what it was going to be until, 5 or 10 paintings in, but I feel like I'm kind of fighting with things a little bit when I do that. So, I don't always have, bolts of lightning inspiration, as much as I wish I did. So sometimes I've got really great ideas for a show ahead of time, and other times I have to let the show kind of feel itself out first.
Okay. And what about music? I see music going in and out of your work. It definitely has played a role in some form or another with Phil Collins or Duran Duran billboards, right? So how does that play into the world that you're building? Is it just because that's in our world and it's always kind of ever present?
Yeah, well, I've since the early days, I've let weird things from my world bleed into my work in a way that initially felt, again, like I said, kind of juvenile when I was painting Chewbacca or Boba Fett for no particularly good reason. But, it later on has become sort of a realization that, elements that are important to my world or important to me personally, why wouldn't those also live in this world that the astronaut lives in? And I find that music is one element. Obviously, TV shows and movies and pop culture elements are a whole other thing. But, I listen to music a lot of the time when I'm in my studio. And music has, and those days when I was wandering around Italy or Australia or even, here, I would almost always be listening to music. And that music kind of became the soundtrack to this exploration. So it just makes sense for me for music to play some sort of role in this world I was building. And especially for, that show 1984 I brought up earlier, and you mentioned Phil Collins and Duran Duran. When I did that show, it kind of seemed like a no-brainer that if I was depicting this, you can go look up this work on my website. It was, this weird sort of hyper-colored 80s world. Well, of course, there's going to be a billboard for Phil Collins in there, or a billboard for Tina Turner, or something like that. that just seemed like as quintessentially 80s as anything else. That music really kind of informed that period of the world and that period, of my childhood. I grew up during that time.
One of the things that I've seen the last couple of years, and it seems to come in and out, but it was really kind of concentrated in a couple of the shows that you did, either in 2019 or 2018, were these geometric shapes that sort of appeared in the sky, lights in the sky. When did those first start appearing, and do you have a particular meaning for them, or are they just design elements?
Yeah, that's one of the things I was talking about when I said that, thinking about these things as chapters has allowed me to take some left turns. I think I reached a point a couple years ago where I kind of realized that I could introduce some very non-representational things into these worlds that I was building, some weird graphic elements that couldn't exist in real life. And I think the first time I started doing it was for that 1984 show, where I wanted them to kind of feel like the astronaut was exploring this like fabricated 80s universe that felt like a memory of my childhood more than the actual real 1984. And so I used these like weird diagonal lines that like, I'm pretty sure I had a Trapper Keeper that had something like that, etched into it. And I used like these really bright purples and pinks that were not realistic at all. And it felt like I had opened this door. It was a real sort of turning point for me where I realized like I can use these elements in a way that I can deploy these unrealistic elements in a way that make the paintings that led this sort of like otherworldliness to them that I really enjoyed. Like they feel like they're recognizable as Earth, but then all of a sudden there's these design elements floating up in the sky that make you go, where is this exactly? And so I started doing that, I think, for that 1984 show, and that led into my algorithm show in San Francisco at Spoke, which was just after that, maybe 6 months thereafter. And what I liked about using them in that show was I wanted the work to have this like real feeling of like this otherworldly technology floating over it in a way that felt sort of mysterious and unexplained. And so having these sort of strange, diagonal design elements just hovering in the sky in like bright purples and greens in a way that was somewhat unexplained made the work feel like there was this odd sort of technological something happening there that was I just like that sort of mood. And I've sort of since then I've done many more works that have that and in more recent years they've sort of come and gone as I've sort of returned to maybe a little bit more of a natural thing. But I sort of pick and choose when I do stuff like that now.
Well, and it does lend itself well to the 80s. For whatever reason, that feels natural in the 80s.
Sure, right?
Neon lights and just crazy colors,
Yeah. People were doing a lot of cocaine back then, I guess. I don't know what that is. I mean, I was 7, so I was not doing cocaine personally, right. But I think there was a lot of weirdness happening back then.
So as far as the mediums that you work in go, you almost exclusively work in oil on canvas. What is it that you like about oil paint? Is it just what you're comfortable with and what you've always used, or are there particular qualities of it that you find appealing?
I mean, pretty much both of those things. I'm very much a creature of habit. I've had the same. I've used mostly the same palette for the last 20 years in terms of like the colors I buy. I use the same brushes. I buy the same canvases. It just allows me to just sort of go in my studio and kind of know what I'm doing. I mean, there's some artists who like to throw roadblocks in their way, and that sort of informs their creative process. For me, I like knowing exactly what I'm getting myself into. I'm a creature of habit, but I like oil paint. I like how it works. It works really well for what I want to do with it. I have in recent years I've started doing a couple murals for the first time, which are like 100 times larger than any of my paintings, and I paint them with house paint, which is just a garbage medium. Sorry, people who like house paint. It doesn't blend well. It's hard to use. It dries fast. It dries a different color than when it's wet. It was very frustrating for me, and like I've learned how to use it a little bit. I've gotten a bit better with it, but oil paint just is super natural to me, and I kind of know what it does. And I've painted I've now made over 450 of these astronaut paintings. Again, mostly in oil, and so I'm constantly surprised that my hand kind of just knows what to do with it. I'll be thinking about something, and all of a sudden I'll have painted like a whole thing, and I don't know how it happens. So it's kind of awesome muscle memory like that.
So as far as your creative process goes, how much like upfront preliminary work do you do in advance of starting on a painting, as far as like composition and figuring out the piece?
A lot. I mentioned a while ago that it took me a long time to get into the rhythm of painting. And after those first, whatever, 3, 4, 5 years, I only had maybe 10, 12 paintings. And part of that was I was just sort of, I didn't have my time management skills very well. But it was also because I came out of this background. Like I said, most of my teachers were in this sort of abstract expressionist mold. And I had this idea that I think is the wrong idea, that painting kind of happens right at the canvas, kind of in this immediate format. And I'm not even sure if the abstract expressionists did it that way themselves, but that was kind of what I thought. And so I would paint in an astronaut, and then I'd realize I needed to move it 2 inches over. And so I would move it over 2 inches, and then I'd realize I liked it better before, and I'd move it back. And then a whole year goes by and you haven't finished a painting. My wife, who I mentioned earlier, who at the time was my girlfriend, she's a nurse now, but she actually went to art school and studied illustration. And she had to do it, she was sort of mandated to do all this research up front and do all these preparatory drawings up front. And she looked at me like I was a giant moron just walking up to my canvas and trying to paint an astronaut in there. And frankly, she was right. And so she really taught me that research and preparation is key. And because I had a day job for so long, I couldn't waste that time in the studio. The time was very precious, and so I learned to do a lot of prep work ahead of time. And so nowadays, I kind of know almost exactly what I'm doing by the time I step up to the canvas. I do, I map everything out in Photoshop ahead of time. I print it out. I translate it to the canvas in pencil. I have things pretty much, and now things do happen at the canvas where I tweak things. Of course, I change some colors, I move stuff around a little bit. But if I have to do a lot of drawing in the paint, in the canvas, it's just going to take too long to do that. And I prefer to not do that if I can.
Yeah, and I saw some of the images that you sent me over for potentially to be used as the cover image of this episode. I saw that you had right next to the painting that you were working on what looked like a digital collage that you had created for a reference image. Is that what your process now involves? Do you create these digital collages in Photoshop?
Yeah, I do. I don't talk. I'm happy to talk about it, but I don't talk about it a lot because I feel like there's a certain magic in the finished product that it's like revealing your magic tricks, but that's fine because anyone who's an artist is going to want to know how I make these things. Yeah, I mock them all up in Photoshop, and I get to the point where they're pretty close to what the finished product is going to be. And then I print them out to scale, and I have them in my studio right next to the canvas. And when I mix colors, I use the printout as sort of a color mapping tool. And so I try to match the colors as close as I can to the printout.
And what did you do before then in order to do your compositions? Did you do it just the old-fashioned way where you just started painting? Or
Yeah, pretty much. I've been doing it this way for a long time now, probably 15 years. It was only the first maybe 5 years I was doing this where I was doing it badly. But I would have like a couple random, like if I was painting a tree and I was painting an astronaut, I was painting a dinosaur, I'd have 3 printouts, one of a tree, one of a dinosaur, and one of an astronaut. And they'd probably be like fuzzy black and white printouts or like crappy like blurry pixelated printouts. And I'd have a couple drawings I did lying around that I would spill paint on. And I would sort of cobble it together both in my mind and I do some drawings and then on the canvas. And it was just a slow, clunky, cumbersome way of doing it. And like I said, I was working as a designer at the time, and I was working in Photoshop all the time. And so it seemed like a total non-brainer to use Photoshop as a tool to help me create these paintings. And it felt like a kind of revelation to me. But I've since talked to, almost every artist I know now. I talk to them, and I think they do something very similar in their methodology.
Well, and it's interesting, the value of the design job had in your career. I mean, because it sort of forced you, because of your time constraints, because it limited the amount of time that you could spend in the studio, it forced you to come up with these types of efficiencies, it sounds like.
Yeah, and that's actually another reason why I'm actually really glad I had the day job for so long. I think if I had jumped into painting earlier, I definitely wouldn't have been as good at it for a variety of reasons. And I think the design career really helped me. It helped me become professional just at a baseline, but it also helped me learn tools, like you said, like computer tools, but also just sort of, it forced me to be very efficient in my studio.
What is your typical workday like now? What is your studio practice like?
So I try to get into the studio for at least, 7 to 9 or 10 hours a day. I need to take time out to do things like social media and emails and stuff like that, which I guess is part of the job. But I try to do like a relatively normal job. I get up in the morning, walk the dog, try to get in the studio by, I don't know, it depends, but anywhere between 9:30 to 10:30. Paint until lunch, take a little break for lunch, answer some emails, get back in the studio for 3 to 4 hours, take a break for dinner, hang out with the wife for a bit, get back in the studio and paint until 11 or 12, and then go to bed.
Right on, right on. So you mentioned this earlier, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about it, was the experience you had painting murals.
Mm-hmm.
So, it seems like the good folks at Powwow helped you pop your mural cherry back in I think it was 2017 at Powwow Worcester, which, first of all, why is Worcester pronounced that way? That's beyond me. But, how did you get involved with them? Was that something that Jasper reached out to you, or that you reached out to them? How did that happen?
Worcester's in Massachusetts, which can't pronounce anything the way it's spelled. It's Worcester, which you would think would be like Worcester, but no, it's Worcester, kid. So I shout out to Che in Worcester. Everybody knows Che. Che's awesome. He's sort of the man on the ground in Worcester who he works for the city of Worcester and helped bring Powwow to Worcester. Worcester is it's kind of a very working class city, about an hour due west of Boston. That at one time was kind of a boom town in the industrial age, and has since fallen on some harder times. Although it's a very nice city, and they have a fantastic museum there. But I met Che. It was funny. I came out to, at the time I was still living in Massachusetts. I now live in Los Angeles. I've lived here for about 1.5 years, but I lived in Massachusetts for a long time. But I flew out to LA for a show I had out here. And I went to a powwow event in Lancaster, California, which is like an hour north of LA. Oddly enough, Lancaster is kind of a similar to LA, what Worcester is to Boston. And they had a powwow event going on there. And I met a whole bunch of people there. And, I said, oh, hey, I'm from Boston. And they said, oh, is that near Worcester? Which, if you're from Massachusetts, is like a super weird thing to ask, because Worcester is a fraction the size of Boston, and up until recently was not known for its art scene at all. It would be kind of like saying, like, if you flew out from New York and people were like, oh, is that near Albany? You'd be like, that's a weird question to ask. Again, sorry to people in Worcester. Worcester's an awesome place. I love Worcester, but it's not as well known as Boston. So I was like, why are people asking about Worcester? And it turned out I kind of knew this, but there was going to be a powwow event in Worcester. And it blew my mind that like Worcester was on the radar of all these art world people out on the West Coast. And I was like, this is awesome. Like I really found it very inspiring. So I drove out to Worcester for when they were having this powwow, and I met Che, and he was an awesome dude. And I met a bunch of the artists there who were doing stuff. And I really just, at the time, I didn't think I was going to be doing any murals, but I wanted to be in on the energy that powwow had. I just thought it was amazing. I was so inspired by it, that they were doing all these murals in Worcester, a place that, kind of, needed something there in the art world to kind of push it forward, I think. And so, I kept in touch with Che, and just sort of loosely. Again, I didn't have any grand aspirations for doing a mural, although the idea was kicking around in my head. I started hanging out with with a friend of mine, Josie Morway, who also lived in Boston. Who's a great, fantastic artist. And she really wanted to do murals, and she was inspiring to me to kind of get off my butt and give it a try. And so I don't know, I posted a painting on Instagram at some point, and Che immediately called me. And like nobody calls me anymore, but Che called me. And he called me and he said, I just want you to know I love what you're doing. If you ever want to paint a mural, I want to be your first call. And I said, well, you know what? I've been thinking about it. I'd love to do a mural. And he goes, I'll get you a wall. And I'm okay, cool. And a few months later, Powwow Worcester was happening, and I reached out to him and I was like, hey, I'd love to do something. And he's like, oh, geez, I think we gave away all our walls, but let me look into it. He was a little bit non-committal, and I was like, oh, okay, if it happens, it happens. If not, that's fine. He called me back the next day. He's like, yep, I hooked you up. You and your friend Josie are going to be in the art museum in Worcester. And I was like, wait a minute. I was kind of hoping for like a wall in an alley where no one would ever like go or see in case I like totally butchered it. And he hooked me up with like, a wall in the lobby of the art museum, which was of amazing. So that was my very first mural.
How did you like that first experience? Was it a learning curve that you had to deal with?
It was terrifying. It was it was a very steep learning curve. I like to say I was there for a full week. I started on Monday and finished it on Friday. And if on Wednesday afternoon you had come in and told me, like, hey, Scott, you can just duck out the back door. We'll paint over this white. No one will ever know it happened. I would have been like, cool, let's do that. I'm like running out of here. It was just not going very well. I had no idea what I was doing. And it was the first time in a long time I felt just out of my depth doing something in the art world. But something kind of clicked by like Thursday morning, and I'm actually really happy with the way it turned out, even though it was really hard. And I've only done 2 other murals, and they've been hard, but I've gotten a little bit better at each one in terms of figuring out kind of how they're done, what I can do.
Yeah, you did one in Denver, I think, right?
Yeah, I did. There was a tech office that invited me to come in and do one in Denver. And that one was tough because it was, the one I did in Worcester it was 10 feet by 35 feet, but I split it in half with my friend Josie. So I only did half of that. And it was really nice having her like working side by side because we kind of worked some stuff out. The one I did in Denver, it was about the same size wall, but I had it all to myself. I had to climb this like sketchy scaffolding like late at night, and I was working like 14-hour days. It was a really and it's physically really grueling. So that one was tough.
And then the very following year, you did Antelope Valley, right? Powell Antelope Valley in California. And that's like an even bigger one. So do you feel like a total pro at this now? Or are you going to be doing the 20-story buildings next?
Do I feel like a pro? Not in the slightest. Do I feel like I finally figured out? It was more just sort of figuring out like what I could, like not biting off more than I can chew. I think the one I did in Lancaster, I returned to Lancaster to do that last mural, and that was. Well, first of all, my wife came up and helped me, which was a huge help. Just having an assistant on hand was amazing. But I kept the design a little bit simpler in a way that I think works. Like I'm happy with how it looks, but I wasn't bogged down in all these details, which are just really hard to do in a mural and maybe don't count as much because you're going to be 20 feet away from it anyways. And so that was the first one I felt like I did where I kind of knew what I could accomplish in a week without killing myself. So I would like to do more. It's been a little while now. I'm still terrified of the idea of doing mural. I've had a couple tentative opportunities come my way, and I'd like to try to do another one maybe soon if I can. We'll see.
Awesome. Very cool. Something else that I wanted to ask you about, last year you came out with your first monogram through Paragon Books, Astronaut Paintings by Scott Listfield, which Paragon Books is Ken's publisher. How did that project come about? Was that something Ken came to you with, or you approached him?
Yeah, that was amazing. So I mentioned my show Algorithm up at Spoke Art in San Francisco. When I flew out for the show, I was signing prints in the gallery ahead of the opening, just like about an hour beforehand. And Ken, who runs Spoke Art, who's awesome, everybody loves Ken. He was wandering through the gallery, and I know they had just done like a couple book projects at the time, and I was really, I was really inspired by it. I thought it was amazing they were doing this. And I was just signing prints, and so I was only like I was half signing and half paying attention to what I was talking about, and I was talking about the books, and Ken just walks by and goes, "Hey, would you like to do a book?" Like it was that casual, and I was like, holy crap, Ken, are you are you being serious? He's like, yeah, let's do a book. And I was like, okay, let's do a book. Like, it was literally that casual he did it. And I think, I don't want to put words into Ken's mouth. I think, for whatever reason for that show Algorithm, I think he had, I usually, all those years working on my efficiency in the studio, I got pretty good at making paintings fast. And so I make a lot of paintings per year, and I take on more shows I think than most artists do. But Ken had asked me to leave sort of a window around his show, which is fine. I respected that. But what happened is I ended up finishing the work really early for that show. I was done ahead of time, which most artists are not. And I had photographed all the work, and I sent them all the work, and I'd cataloged it. And so I was ready to go a month ahead of time, and I was really well organized. And I had mentioned that I keep high-res images of every single one of my paintings. They're all labeled and stored up in the cloud, ready to go. And Ken kind of knew this, and I think he knew, one of the hardest things with bringing together an artist's book is just sort of wrangling all those images. And I literally, I emailed him a link the next day, and he had it all, it was all there. So he kind of knew that I was, I'm prepared, I'm ready to go. That said, we pulled together the entire book in, I think, 3 weeks.
Wow. And
he had a shout out to Sean, who did all the design work. He had a fantastic designer who pulled together the design. But I think I had a background in design, so I kind of helped out. I designed the cover. I wrote all the sections of the book myself, other than the intro bits. And I did all of that writing and editing and everything else while I was getting ready to move across country in 3 weeks' time. And it's kind of a minor miracle that we pulled together the book. And I'm really, really happy with it. There's few things in my career I'm as proud of as that book. I'm shocked. I've looked through the whole book and I've only found one very, very tiny typo in the whole thing, which is kind of amazing. And so, huge shout out to Ken for having faith in me that we could pull that together in short notice.
What was the nature of the writing? I know it has like 9 chapters that you wrote yourself. Was it background on the pieces, your career? What was the write-ups for?
Yeah, so we had to figure out a format for the book. And again, I think oddly enough, my design background helped in this. I had to think of, Ken suggested we break the book into sort of chapters that were based on themes in my work. And a lot of design is about kind of architecture. Like if you're building a website, you need to kind of think about information in a way where you sort of catalog things in a way that's going to make sense to people. And not that I hadn't been thinking about these ideas in my artwork anyways, but I had never really formalized it. So I kind of broke the artwork up into like 6 or 7 groups, and then wrote, a page or 2 about each of those groups, just in terms of my thinking about those subject matter, subjects that were important to me. And then I wrote an intro page about why I paint astronauts, which is largely the story I told earlier. And then I wrote a page at the end. I mentioned earlier in this podcast, I mentioned my friend Chris Ostoy, who was, my sort of a mentor figure to me. I have memorialized him in my work. Anyone who's sort of looked at my work a lot will see this name, Ostoj, Ostoy.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah,
I
saw that.
It's pronounced Ostoy. It appears as this graffiti tag in a lot of my work. I've probably done it, I don't know, like 50 or 60 times now. And that's my friend Chris. And people ask me about that all the time. It's really sort of humbling to me that people notice that. They look at my work closely enough to notice that. And so I wrote a chapter that explained who Chris was and why I decided to remember him in my work. And that was kind of important for me to do too. And I kind of wanted to tell this sort of whole story about who I am and why I do what I do. And to be able to do that in a book is really kind of amazing to do. I'm doing this in a podcast right now, which is awesome. Don't get me wrong, but to be able to have like this physical thing that sort of tells my story is kind of amazing.
For sure. Do you enjoy writing? Is that something you feel you excel at?
I love writing. I really do. I actually think I never studied writing really, and I've never pursued it as anything really seriously, but I actually do think if I hadn't ended up as an artist, that writing might have been something that I would do. And I don't get to do it enough, but I like writing about my work a lot. And an artist kind of fall into 2 camps. Either they absolutely hate it or they really enjoy it. I really enjoy it. I find it both fun. It allows me to write, which I enjoy, but it also, I learn a lot about writing about it and talking about it like we're doing now. I actually learn a lot of things about my work that I maybe wouldn't have discovered otherwise, just by going through the process of thinking about it and verbalizing it.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, let's talk about your upcoming show. So you have a new show coming out at ThinkSpace called This Is America. Opens May 30th, which will be about a week and a half, 2 weeks after this show comes out. So what can you tell us about the show? With the title, it would suggest that there's a little bit more of a political slant. But what could you tell us about the body of work that you created?
So my last show I had at ThinkSpace, which was 2 years ago, was the one I mentioned earlier called 1984, which I think was a really pivotal show for me because it allowed me to, I think it was a very political show. Themes of 1984 are very dark and have relevance to what we're going through right now. But I simultaneously painted the show with all these like candy colors and pinks and purples, and I painted Phil Collins, for God's sakes. Like it was actually a really fun show. And I managed to do a show that had some real dark political meaning to it in a way that felt kind of light and fun. And so, for this follow-up show, which is going to be a much bigger show, that show had maybe, I think, 13 paintings. This one's going to have 24. I kind of wanted to return to those ideas. It's 2020. It's an election year. There are a lot of like big things happening in America. I wanted to talk about that in a way that, had some seriousness to it, but that also felt kind of but didn't feel overwhelming or dark, like had some sort of lightness to it. And so Andrew, the curator at ThinkSpace, also awesome dude. Andrew's great. Everybody loves Andrew. He had pitched this idea to me a while back about doing a show about national parks for this show, which I really liked that idea because that seemed kind of timely. It seemed like I could do that in a way that felt a little bit political, but that sort of delved into nature in a way that I've touched on nature a lot in my work, but I've never had like a real kind of old school landscape show. Now, I looked into it, and there are other artists who've done a lot of work with national parks, and I think they've done it well. And so I don't know if I wanted to go over that ground again, but I like the idea of the landscape of America as this sort of metaphor. And not just the landscape, but a lot of the sort of monuments, Mount Rushmore and Statue of Liberty and the Grand Canyon and these things that we think of as iconically American, and kind of what that means right now at an age where, America's at really this sort of weird turning point where what does America even mean anymore? And so I wanted to dive into that as sort of this subject and like have the astronaut explore this very like natural landscape that may or may not be disappearing and may or may not be losing its meaning. And so I started work. Like I said, it's 24 paintings, so I think might be my largest show to date. And I got about 2/3, 3/4 of the way done with it. And then all of a sudden, we're all in a quarantine. We're all on lockdown. And the world outside and inside looks very different than what it did even a few weeks ago. And I started hearing from people online, like saying, "Oh my God, your work suddenly feels even more resonant than it did before." Because my work is very much about this astronaut exploring this kind of like empty landscape where it feels there's hints that something happened because no one's really there anymore. But I'm never all that specific about what happened. And so I felt very torn about that. Like on the one hand, it's always great for your work to be relevant. Like you want to be timely. You want to feel like you're sort of in that zeitgeist. On the other hand, I don't want to, I never wanted my paintings to come true. Exactly. Like a lot of what I do in my work is a little bit of not a warning, but it's sort of the future is what we make of it. We can live in Mad Max in 50 years, or we could choose not to do that, And so I felt very torn by the world sort of taking this left turn into the sort of darker realms of my work. And all of a sudden I realized this body of work I was working on really, in a way, was speaking about what we're all going through right now. And so, the title of the show, This is America, was inspired by the Childish Gambino song that came out a couple years ago, and more specifically the video, which I thought was one of the more powerful pieces of art I've seen in recent years.
That's amazing.
That was his take on what America was like for him. And it came out in 2018. And so this show I wanted to be about what America is like for me in 2020. And weirdly enough, a part of that has become this sort of quarantine, even though I didn't set out for the show to be about that. It kind of has to be about that. I think, the show comes out May 30th. I don't know right now whether we're going to have any sort of public viewing of the show. It might end up being entirely online, which is, I've come to terms with that. It's okay. But, we're living in very strange times. And I feel like it's, for better or worse, it's my responsibility to talk about that in some sort of way.
Right. And you mentioned, the work sort of being a little bit more of a warning. And you did send me over a preview, and thank you for that. I noticed nods to climate change. There's certain elements in there where you have monuments that are kind of got water coming up, and so it very much feels like that warning, like, hey, be careful, you're on the edge of this precipice. Don't go over. And I love the U.S. Space Force nod as well.
Thanks. Yeah, I like to be timely in my work, which I try to make work that will last a while, that will still be relevant. Hopefully 10, 20, 100 years from now. But it's also important to me to include some nods to what's happening in the present. And it's such a weird, ridiculous time we live in right now. There's so much strange stuff happening. But yeah, I themes of the environment have always been important to me. And I think, this work for the show got I was a little there's notes of anger in this work, I think, a little bit more. I tried to, but I also, like, I really dove into the landscape in a way where I think there's some works where I was just like, I just want to make this a beautiful painting, which is definitely something I think about, but not always my straight up motivation. But there was also some anger there where I was thinking, like, we need to do something right now about the environment, and we're kind of letting it go, or this world that we live in is just not going to be, it's not going to be what we want it to be at all. This quarantine we're living in right now might be, that might be a predictor of the way things go in the future. And I don't know. We gotta do something.
With the platform that you've created, throughout your career, do you feel some kind of responsibility to contribute to that discourse in some way, in your own way? And is this show sort of a manifestation of that in some ways?
I do, for sure. I think, I realized, again, 4 years ago when the election happened, my work had always been subtly political, but not overtly political. And I kind of realized, somehow, some way, through luck or whatever, I've managed to accumulate a fairly decent-sized following online, which I'm thankful for and I appreciate. And it occurred to me, I was worried about maybe doing something that would anger some percentage of those people and turn them off, as I think most people are. But it also occurred to me, like, at this moment in time, I have an audience. If I don't say something now, I'm not going to feel good about myself down the road. Like, if I look back at history and say, well, I didn't stand up and say something at that time, then what am I really doing? What is this all for? And so I definitely do try to use my work to say something. But like I said, I try to say it in a way that's not hitting you over the head with a mallet, that's not being aggressive about it, and that if you don't want to, if you want to just look at my work and be like, oh, cool, an astronaut, like, that's fine. I'm fine with that. If you want to look at it for some deeper meaning, I'm also okay with that. And I feel like I do have things to say.
With the name of the show being This Is America, is the soundtrack for this entirely Childish Gambino? Like, you've been doing this, you've been doing the soundtrack, thing on Instagram. What is the soundtrack for this show?
Yeah, well, so one of the we're all stuck in quarantine. We're all a little bit desperate for content. And one of the things I've been thinking about for a long time is sort of pairing music along with some of my paintings. So I'm doing a running playlist on Instagram where I'll post paintings with music that I feel like goes with that. For this show, I don't think the entire show is set to Childish Gambino, but that one song, I actually love Childish Gambino. One of my, I'm not really a huge music nerd, and I don't have many moments I could point to, but I saw Childish Gambino in concert like in 2011 or something. I was ahead of the curve on that one. I've loved him for a long time. But that song in particular seems really, really poignant, and so that's definitely the theme for the whole show. But I think I could pick other songs to go with some of the other paintings.
Okay, right on. And you mentioned this earlier, the effect that COVID-19 might have on the exhibition. Have you talked at all to Andrew about what that might look like and how he will be conducting the opening?
Yeah, Andrew's been really great about it. I think he realized pretty quickly what this meant. The whole COVID-19 situation for art galleries. That we couldn't have in general, he couldn't have an art opening. And so he's been very proactive about figuring out how we can create an environment where people feel like they're seeing the show, even though they can't get there. And so I don't know for certain yet whether we'll be able to have an opening or not, but I'm sort of operating like we won't. Just if it happens, that'd be awesome and I'll be excited, obviously. But if it doesn't happen, I will hopefully not be crushed and disappointed. But he's been doing a great job of doing lots of live stuff on Instagram. He's got his photographer Birdman coming in, who's awesome. He does a lot of photography here in LA for art shows. He's got Birdman coming in doing like 3D photography stuff, virtual walkthroughs of the gallery that really feel, it doesn't replace an opening. An opening is fantastic, but it really feels like you're there in the gallery. It gives you a physical presence in the way that just sort of looking at the work online doesn't, which is nice. He's been doing some really fun events. He's got LC, one of the co-owners of ThinkSpace, as a DJ.
Those have been amazing.
Have you watched some of those? He does like DJ nights
incredible.
On Friday. He's really he's fantastic. I was watching the last one too, and so he's doing a fantastic job just approaching people online. I think people in general have kind of realized that everything's migrated online, and we're getting better about using online stuff to fill in kind of the blanks of the world we're living in right now, where we can't have that sort of one-to-one human you can't go out and see your friends and everything, but you can talk to them on Zoom, which isn't as good, but it's something. Andrew's been really, really great about that, and I know we've got some plans, and I've got some ideas. We might do a studio walkthrough while the work is still here in my studio, something like that. I don't know. We'll see. We've got lots of ideas for stuff to do, and I think we'll definitely get people excited by it. It's still a bummer if if we can't have an opening, but the world's a bummer right now, so we make do with what we got.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you a little bit more about how you're dealing with everything that's going on. And I know you've mentioned on your Instagram that your wife is a nurse, and you said it earlier in the show, which I can't even imagine just how stressful that must be. Her and the healthcare workers like her are just complete rock stars, in everybody's book. So how are you guys holding up with everything?
Well, on my end, out of everybody in the world, my day-to-day life has changed the least, probably. I mean, I spend all day in my studio just kind of like normal, just with more weird existential dread about the world around me. But otherwise, I'm just sort of painting, and I can't really go outside much. Don't get me wrong, I would love to go outside and see friends, but my day-to-day hasn't changed that much. My wife is really, I can't even put into words what she's going through right now. People call nurses and doctors heroes right now, and they are, certainly, but I think that to a certain extent makes them, how do I want to say this? Like, they just, they don't want to be heroes. They just want to do their job, right? They want to be paid well. They want to have health benefits. They want to not be, sort of jerked around. They want to not work 20 hours a day. They want to not have to face off against protesters like downtown who are being idiots. They want people to stay safe so that they can do their jobs. They don't want to have to be heroes. They want to just sort of do their thing. They want to not have to risk their lives every day to do what they love to do. So it has been really hard for her. She works at she's the head of nursing at an elder care facility here in California. And so she's not at a hospital, though she has worked at hospitals in the past, but she's kind of on the front line of trying to, because it's the elderly that are really at most risk. And it's these, assisted living facilities that have been kind of the hotbed for a lot of the diseases that's going around. And so she and her entire staff have been, killing themselves, keeping the virus out of their facility, like doing whatever they can. And they've been doing a great job, but it's I see her every day, I talk to her every day, and I still can't really wrap my head around what she's doing. It's really hard. It's really tough. I'm not trying to undersell the role that art plays in the world. I actually think art has a very important role. It doesn't compare to what she's doing. She's literally saving people's lives. Yeah. I'm hopefully trying to make the world a slightly better place while we're all stuck in here. And it's really important to me, and I'm hoping that I'm doing it, even if it's a really small thing. But huge shout out to all the nurses out there, all the medical professionals, everybody, all the people working in supermarkets and driving trucks and doing the jobs that we take for granted the rest of the time when we're not in crisis. And I hope that when we get out of this crisis, that we will not take them for granted.
No, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think it's important that we don't just call them heroes, throw them a parade, and walk away. That we actually pay them a living wage. Not just the healthcare, but like you said, the grocery store workers. That everybody that's out there that's considered essential, let's appreciate them like they are essential, and not just call them a hero. The just calling them hero and walking away is like the equivalent of thoughts and prayers. It's like you're not doing anything, Yeah. So let's actually appreciate them,
Yeah. I mean, by all means, we can give them a parade too. But I think at the end of the day, what they want is not a parade. It's like you said, to be paid a living wage, to have more respect, and to just be able to do their jobs and live their lives. And a lot of people are doing this not to be heroes, because they have no other choice. That if they don't do it, they'll be out of work, they'll be out of healthcare at a time where that's a really scary proposition. So.
Yeah, for sure. And I also saw that you had offered on your Instagram to speak to university classes that might want to invite you, which is a wonderful idea. And it's really great of you to give your time to that. Did any of them take you up on that?
Yeah, actually, I've done, I think, 4 or 5 of them now. It occurred to me, again, I'm not a hero by any means. And, I'm not doing what my wife is doing, where she's literally saving people's lives every day. But it did occur to me that I have this platform where people follow me online. Is there any small things I can do to help out? And one thought that I had was that, God, it must just suck to try to teach an art class right now, right? I mean, it sucks all teachers are dealing with this right now. It's got to be hard, but like, if you're teaching a printmaking class, you can't teach like acid bath etching or like figure sculpture or like old school photography or like filmmaking. Like you just can't really teach that when kids are stuck at home, living in their parents' house while all they've got is whatever they can find in their garage. It sucks for the students, it sucks for the teachers. And so I sort of put up this thing on Instagram where I said, hey, anybody wants to take me on the offer, I'll zoom in, I'll talk to your class for an hour about my work, I'll fill some time. It's when you're going to get an opportunity to talk to, and not that I'm awesome, but like, if you're somewhere in the middle of the country or wherever, do you get the chance to talk to a living artist in LA who's making a go of it? Probably not on a daily basis. So I'm happy to do that. And I've had, like I said, 4 or 5 groups reach out to me. I've done a couple colleges and a couple high school classes. And it's been a really fun experience. Like I enjoy talking about my work. I enjoy engaging with students. It's a little tougher to do online because, I can't even make eye contact with the students. I can't even look at them when they're asking questions. They just sort of, plug in a question on the sidebar of Zoom, and that's what I get. But the feedback I've gotten it's been really nice. The teachers and professors who've reached out to me, I think, have appreciated. And again, it's a very, very tiny gesture in the grand scheme of everything that's happening. But I don't, I'm happy to volunteer a little bit of my time if it makes an art student's life a little bit better, or if it makes an art teacher's life a little bit better, even for an hour.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, tell people where they can find you online.
I'm super easy to find online. My name is Scott Listfield. I'm the only Scott Listfield in the world, which is awesome. It helps me. I'm at Scott Listfield on various social media. My website is astronautdinosaur.com, which I registered a long time ago. I'm super easy to find. You can reach out to me. I'm happy to answer questions. Look for my show at ThinkSpace coming up end of May. I'm very excited about the show, even though it's arriving at a slightly weird time. I think it speaks to what's happening now. So I hope people will go online and check it out.
Awesome. Incredible. So one last question. It's something that I ask everybody. Who is one artist that you'd like to see me have on the show?
So I knew you were going to ask this because I've listened to your podcast a lot lately. It's very hard to pick just one artist because I have literally hundreds of art friends. But I mentioned my friend Josie Morway earlier, who I collaborated on the mural with. I think she's an insanely talented painter who paints animals, but mostly birds that feel almost like religious icons. There's like a real weight to them, and they have a real personality where you feel like these birds and animals have almost something to say. And she's one of the smartest artists I've met. But I think she feels, shout out to Josie. She usually tells me she feels nervous about talking about her work, but I think it would be good for her because she posts some really, really amazing thoughts about her work. And I'd be curious to hear her talk more about it. So she'd be my choice, I think.
Well, and her recent show for ThinkSpace was incredible.
Oh, just amazing. Just amazing. Yeah. I love her work a lot. She's really profoundly great at what she does.
Awesome. Well, Scott, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. This was a really fun experience.
So that's it for this episode of Art Affairs. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Scott. I find the story behind Scott's work so fascinating. He referred to it as accidentally brilliant. And while I'm not sure how accidental it was definitely brilliant. And in the same way Scott's career has grown and flourished over the years, the idea behind his work and the stories he's telling become more and more relatable. It's like an idea that's truly come into its time. I mean, it's so easy to feel alienated, even in your very own home. This world is moving at such a breakneck speed, and if you just blink, it's as if the world has already moved beyond you and you have to catch up. It's the exact same feeling that Scott felt after traveling abroad, which ultimately gave birth to all of these works. But I think in recent years, it's become an almost universal experience. and these worlds he's creating are continually more relatable. But as Scott said, is that necessarily a good thing? Perhaps his work can even help further the conversation about moving us back from the edge of the cliff, even if slightly. And even if it doesn't and nothing changes, at least he's trying. And, if everyone did that, we might actually have a chance out of this thing. Scott's new body of work is really solid. He sent me over a preview just before we recorded, and it's definitely some of the best work he's done. The show is titled This Is America, and it opens at ThinkSpace on Saturday, May 30th. So that should be just short of 2 weeks after this show comes out. And as Scott mentioned, barring any kind of sudden miracle, the show opening will most likely be a virtual one. So do check out ThinkSpace's Instagram for updates on how they're going to do that. The last couple of show openings they've done, they did live on their Instagram, and they were super fun to tune into. Andrew gives us a nice walk around the gallery, seeing all the work hung, and Elsie absolutely destroys on the turntables. It's about as close to experiencing and attending an actual opening in person as you can really create on Instagram. So definitely check that out. And again, that's Saturday, May 30th. I will definitely be watching. So thanks again to Scott for joining me today, and thank you for checking out the show. I'm truly grateful for your support. Feel free to shoot me an email if you have any suggestions for the show, or if there's a guest you want me to try and have on. I'd love to hear any feedback you might have for me. You can contact me through my website at artafairspodcast.com, and like I said at the front of the show, you can go there to check out any previous episodes. You can also find the show on Instagram and Facebook at Artaffairs Podcast. And last but not least, if you're listening from Apple Podcasts, I'd be super grateful if you took a moment to review the show. So until next time, especially in these times, be good to yourself and be good to each other.